Buen día a todos.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to all the representatives and people from all the different countries and the government forums in Latin America. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, where we're going to be holding the 8th technical session, the Focal Mexico permits, and the topic of this conference, as we told you before via email, it is about permits and costs for the adoption of the IPSAS. This conference is because we had some questions that were expressed by some of the members of the forum, so we thought it was important to bring this up. And thank you so much, Dr. Kamira, for always being there and being attentive to the needs of the members of the forum. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, everybody, and Dave Warren, of course. And thank you so much for being with us today. And obviously, the goal today is to hear firsthand from all the representatives here today a little bit about the criteria that we have for permits and costs that come with this adoption, direct or indirect, of the ISPS. Dr. Kamira is going to give us some basic instructions so that we can carry out this session, and she will be supporting us with the presentation. So thank you so much, and let's move on.
Thank you very much, Kamira, for the warm welcome, and it's always a pleasure to join this group. We always have very lively discussions, so appreciate you all joining and allowing us to be here to talk about some very important matters to both sides. The reason why I wanted to kick things off and start the presentation is I wanted to spend a few minutes, and I really will only be a few minutes, just walking through how we set up the agenda today. If you look at the very top of this screen, the first bullet there is introduction. I'll provide a short introduction, a couple minutes long, that really focuses on what the International Federation of Accountants is and its relationship with IPSASB. Some of you may be well aware of the relationship, others may not, but I thought it was a good opportunity to refresh any knowledge that you might have on this. Then we'll turn over to Michelle Brody, who will really go through really the purpose of this the meeting today, and that's really to focus on the intellectual property that Juan Torres alluded to at the very beginning of the presentation. And then for the bulk of the meeting today, we'll go over to question and answers. And I see kind of half an hour to 40 minutes where we'll just have an open question and answer period. I'm happy to take any questions. Michelle, myself, and perhaps Ross will answer questions where we're able to. One point I wanted to make clear on the Q&A or question and answers is, and I think Kamira mentioned this up front, we do have the chat function available. That's so participants can chat amongst each other or ask questions amongst each other. We will not be monitoring that to answer questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and ask them in person, and we'll answer them live. And then finally, at the very end, with probably 5 minutes left to go, we'll ask Mr. Juan Torres to take over and wrap us up. So with that, I'll start with a brief introduction of the International Federation of Accountants, or Ifac. And Ifac really at its core is a global organization that represents the accounting profession globally. And you can see from this slide that we're made up of over 180 member organizations across 135 countries, representing more than 3 million professional accountants. And when I step back, what Ifac really does is it supports the profession on a global perspective. And I really see this in two main branches. The first is real support to member bodies, and that might be through education sessions or supporting with education or intellectual property, as we're going to discuss today, or standards development. And that's really providing resources to those jurisdictions. And then the other side of that support is more broad, and I see it as elevating the profession or making sure the profession maintains a good name globally. And I'll speak a little more about that, but those are the two main areas that I really see Ifac supporting the profession. When I move to this slide, you'll see the very top bullet focuses on the purpose of Ifac. And really, like I said, the purpose of IFAC is to enhance the profession. I talked a little bit about education standards. You also see adoption and implementation where IFAC will really go out and support the adoption and implementation of whether it's audit standards, private sector standards, public sector standards, ethics standards, anything in that regard. IFAC really likes to get behind and ensure that jurisdictions are fully aware and fully up to date on the latest guidance and high quality guidance that's out there. The other aspect of this, and I touched on this on the last slide, is enhancing the profession globally. And one area that comes to mind right now is IFAC's really taken a lead on sustainability reporting or climate change and positioning the profession as a critical component of moving forward on climate change and any kind of sustainability reporting. So that's another, in my view, a really important branch of what IFAC does in supporting the profession. We'll move one level down below purpose to strategic objective. The IFAC has several strategic objectives, but the one I wanted to focus on today was contributing to the development of high quality standards. And this is where the link between the International Federation of Accountants and the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, or IPSASB, really come together. Because the IFAC wants to support high quality standards, and that's exactly what the IPSASB does. We develop high quality public sector accounting standards. And the way that IFAC and by extension the IPSASB define high quality standards is really to ensure that there's a way to enhance consistency globally amongst these standards. So if these standards are enhancing consistency, that's one measure of quality. The second is to be able to hold decision makers accountable. So can the users of that financial information look at it and be able to decide whether decision makers have made an appropriate decision? And then finally, to enhance global consistency. So again, that's really how the IFAC and the IPSASB have really aligned objectives as it relates to that one strategic objective of the IFAC. Now, what's important to note is that because of the strategic objective, the IFAC really wants to support standards development. And one way it does that, and the biggest way it does that for the IPSASB, is through support through funding. IFAC provides a significant portion of the IPSASB's operating budget. That really goes to staffing costs, travel costs, roundtable events or events such as these where the IPSASB needs to go out, or the IFAC needs to go out and explain or educate what's going on with the profession or specifically with the IPSASB. We're also supported through communications and publications, which we'll touch on a little today, information technology, so that will be whether it's hosting meetings virtually or even the hardware that we use day to day to develop standards. IFAC supports there. IFAC also supports with the human resources department to ensure that we have strong hiring practices, a strong code of conduct to ensure that IPSASB operates as a leader in the human resource area. And then finally, the IFAC also supports from an administrative perspective. Probably the most important point that I hope people take away from this short presentation, this is my last slide, is while IFAC provides significant support to the IPSASB, in no way does it influence the IPSASB. And I think this diagram really illustrates that well. If we start on the right-hand side, the IPSASB side, you'll see, and if we start right on the IPSASB diagram, the development of IPSAS, the International Public Sector Accounting Standards, are supported by IPSASB staff. And IPSASB staff, like I said, supports the IPSASB, but in no way does the IFAC get involved in what IPSASB staff should be doing or what projects they should work on. And similarly, when the IPSASB issues a consultation paper, an exposure draft, or a final pronouncement, they really report to the Public Interest Committee, which is the top box on the right. The Public Interest Committee is made up of four global organizations and again has no direct relationship at all with the IFAC. So everything that the IPSASB issues and publishes is completely independent of the IFAC, and the IFAC really has no stake or I guess influence in what the IPSASB develops. Like I said, it's important to see how the IFAC is involved, but IFAC really Supports from a staffing level and ensures, like I said on the previous slide, that we have centralized resources that are being provided to the IPSASB. So I will stop there. If there's any questions, please raise your hand after Michelle's presentation. We'll take them in the open Q&A. So Michelle, I'll turn it over to you, and you can take us through intellectual property.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. And thank you to Kamira, Juan, Torres, and everybody here today for giving me the opportunity to speak with you, to give you an overview of the important work that the Intellectual Property Department at Ifac does, and answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please, Dave. So the Intellectual Property Department can sometimes get a little bit of a bad reputation. So what I wanted to do today before we kind of got into the question and answer portion is to not only explain what we do, but the rationale behind it. So why we do what we do. So the IP policies at Ifac really support the significant work that's carried out by the standard setting boards like IPSASB, by Ifac and Ifac's member bodies. The goal of the Intellectual Property Department really is to help support adoption and implementation efforts, not sort of create a barrier to them. But what's important here is that we want to balance accessibility with good intellectual property stewardship. And what that really means is that we ensure appropriate access to standards and accompanying guidance. We can ensure publications are being appropriately used, that translations, which we'll go into in a little bit, are leading to uniformity to the best of our ability, and that we can also monitor who's using the materials and how. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? Just to set this out at the forefront. We have a relatively simple permission request system. So all of these requests are submitted via our online permission request and inquiry system, which we call OPRI. It's accessible to members and non-members alike. It's simply through our website. You need to register to be able to submit a permission request. And then we ask you to fill out some information, which really helps us understand the nature of the request, as well as the relevant terms that we need to put into the agreement to license the right to reproduce or translate, in some instances, the content. One thing I'll note here as well is our standards and the accompanying supporting documents that are published, either by IPSASB or by Ifac, they're all freely available on the Ifac website. But there's a difference between having it available and being able to use it without the relevant permission. So that's just one thing I wanted to highlight. You can, of course, reference all of the documents for your own personal use. But if you're looking to reproduce within an organization, within a government, or for commercial purpose, or if you're looking to translate the standards, then you do need to submit a permission request. Next slide, please, or the next two slides. So the first thing we'll kind of highlight is the reproduction policy. So it's important to note that reproduction can be in whole or in part. So it's not just if you're reproducing the entirety of the IPSASB handbook. If there are specific standards or even sections within a standard that you're looking to reproduce, this would be subject to our permissions policy and to a permission request. The reproduction can be in English, or it could be a reproduction of the Ifac authorized Spanish translation. It can be for non-commercial or commercial purposes. And of course, it can be for the purpose of legal adoption or for reference. And you can read a little bit more about our reproduction policy in the link. Again, it's on our website under the intellectual property section for your reference. Next slide, please. So in terms of fees for reproducing, for our member bodies, there is no fee for reproduction or translation of publications. This takes into account the fact that, first of all, there are membership dues, so they're already contributing, but they're contributing in multiple ways, whether it's through their time, resource, volunteer work. And so this really recognizes the significant resources that they're already contributing to the development of these standards. For any non-members, so any third parties as we call them, but this can include governmental organizations, regulators, commercial organizations, a fee is typically involved. The fee depends on the nature of the request. So for a commercial reproduction, it would likely include a royalty. And this just, again, recognizes the fact that somebody is regularly profiting off of the work that's been done. And for adoption, there is a smaller fee It's an annual fee. And again, this is based on a number of factors when we look at licensing a reproduction. And again, just to reiterate the point, this helps us support the sustainability and contribution to the development of the standards. So, all of this is being funneled back into the development of these high quality standards that Dave mentioned. Next slide, please, or next two. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on briefly was the translations policy. So what we really try to do is encourage one single high quality, faithful translation per language. This really goes into the point that Dave was making earlier about enhancing consistency. So to the best of our ability, we want to ensure that there's consistent terminology, consistent translations are being used, and that they're really being carried out by organizations that have intimate knowledge of the technical terms, as well as sort of the meaning and understanding behind the standards. You may have noticed if you've gone to look for our Spanish translations that we do actually have two Spanish translations. One is done by our member body in Spain, and one is done for sort of Latin American Spanish to take account the sort of differences in terminology between the two dialects. So the translations policy is particularly important because it's really the key to facilitating implementation and adoption in non-English speaking regions. So the translations process, as I said, allows us to ensure consistency, sustainability, and most importantly, access to the standards in a language other than English. And it also, going through this process, it also ensures that we're able to license the translations to other bodies as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the translations work that we carry out, we have translations in 54 different languages. Last year alone, we facilitated over 120 unique translations comprised of 23 different languages, many of them in Spanish. And if you're ever curious to see what's been translated or what's in progress of being translated, you can access our translations database and you can filter by language as well as source. So if you're looking for content in Spanish for IPSASB in particular, we have a really easy resource for you to do that. So next slide. So that's really the brief presentation and overview that I wanted to give. As I said, happy to answer all the questions that I can, and anything that I can't, I'm happy to take away and answer at a later time.
Muchas gracias, Michelle. Muchas gracias, Dave.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you very much, Dave, for your presentations. I think it sheds some light on the effort you're doing for all countries to working on this international norms. And I think there are maybe some questions from the countries present. I would like them to feel free to ask questions. And, Ifac has been supporting the IPSASB board for a while. And so thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, for your answer via email. We had a pretty specific case and we were able to answer the doubts that that country had presented. So thank you very much. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Yes, in the chat right now, we don't have any questions, but I am looking to see if anybody's raising their hand or if anybody wants to participate. You can open your microphone and ask any questions you have. Good morning. Good morning. We are from Guatemala. Yes, go ahead. Yes, good morning, everybody. A pleasure to greet you. Thank you for this presentation. We have one question at this time. In fact, well, we're very thankful for the answers we received to some questions about the costs of implementing the norms, but the standards. But if you could expand on that, we asked if there was any cost when developing national standards. We are developing these standards through the indirect method. We received an answer saying that in fact we need to ask for Ifac's authorization because that's considered to be a reproduction of the standards, and there were some associated costs. I don't know if you could expand on that, on what we should do. We're still developing the standards. They have not been approved yet. We're in that process, but before trying to get them approved, we would like to know if we need that permit, that authorization to do it beforehand. How can we go about that, and what would be the associated costs? Michelle or Dave could take that question, please.
Sure. So thank you very much for your question. So this is a specific situation. When we talk about reproduction, we do talk about reproduction that's sort of public facing. So if you are taking content and in this case, developing your own standards and then publishing them for others to reference, that would be considered a reproduction. And in fact, we kind of term it a reproduction adoption agreement. So I understand that at the moment you're still working through developing these, and so they haven't been approved yet and they're not yet public facing. So what my recommendation would be in this case is really, it'd be good to give us a heads up just so, we understand your activities, we understand your plan going forward. I would then say at the point in time in which you are ready to publish these standards, you would submit a permission request via our online permission request and inquiry system, so OPRI, which was the system that I mentioned earlier in the slide. And that will really help us understand exactly what you're planning on doing with the standards. So if you're reproducing them in part, building upon them, that still constitutes a reproduction, per Ifac reproduction policies. And the associated costs, again, will come when we further understand the use and the specifics. So as I said, there's not one single fee that sort of fits all. And that's why we have the permission request system. It really helps us understand the specific nature of the request, which then helps us tailor the agreement to that specific request.
Bien, muchas gracias, Michelle.
Very well. Thank you very much, Michelle. We have also another question from Cynthia. Cynthia, if you can open your microphone. Thanks. Let me remove my mask for a second. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Ecuador. My question relates a little bit to Guatemala's question, but the difference is we already have a published standard. We have been working on it for several years. This is a norm that's converges with NICSP. We have some norms on equipment, inventory, investment, biological products. So it's different because it's published already. What I understood is that if we were about to be published right now, we would have to discuss it. So what would be the process? Maybe we need to share with you the standards that we have already so that you can analyze that and see which parts we have used as a reference, because it is not a direct adoption of the standards themselves. It's a convergence. So we have reviewed or revised our national norms and we're applying different aspects. We have used as a reference what NICSP says and what needs to be applied. So that's my questions about the process we need to follow, taking into account that in Ecuador we already have a published version. We have a 2016 version that was already in conversion with the ISPs, and we have to do a review now or revision because of several norms that were lacking, like in the case of instruments, social benefits. So we will be updating, and we would like to know how to proceed. Maybe we can forward our standards to you and then maybe wait for your response to see what the level of reproduction is and what the associated costs would be. So slightly different than the previous questions, because in our case, we already have published versions of our national standards. I don't know if you can give me a response or you need some clarification. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I think this is a really good opportunity to kind of talk about this, because this certainly isn't the first time where, somebody's already adopted, because there is, I think, a little bit of, sort of confusion in this space about what you can do with these public standards, what constitutes reproduction and what doesn't. So I'll sort of just preface this by saying the best case is always to submit a permission request, because if we look at it and we say, that you don't need to get an agreement, you're either reproducing a very small amount of content, or, the way that you're utilizing the standard constitutes reproduction. And, simple as that, and we can go on, but at least we have that knowledge there. The second piece is, if something has already been published, we can always issue a retroactive agreement. So again, better to submit that permission request and get things done appropriately, because we understand that things happen. So it's fine. As for this situation, that would be really my advice, is to submit the permission request so that we can understand exactly what you're doing, how much of the content that you're actually reproducing. If you're just making reference to it, or you're reproducing a very finite amount of content, for us, that would kind of constitute fair use. And so we wouldn't need a reproduction agreement in that case. However, if you're using, a substantial amount of the content and reproducing it, even if it's not the full standard, that would constitute a reproduction. But again, it's sort of hard to say right now without seeing the content what constitutes substantial and what's fair use, which is why a permission request is important, because it gives us the details and information that we need to make that determination. So to sum up, I would say submit the permission request. You can also feel free to email me the content, and we can go from there.
Gracias. Solo quisiera saber.
Thank you. Thank you, Beatriz, Juan, and maybe at the end of the talk, you can share this information via email and how the entire process works, so that we know who to contact, who should do it in every country. I would be very grateful if you can do that. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your answer.
Absolutely.
Cynthia, going back to the question that you're posing here, perhaps we're going to share with you what Michelle mentioned when she was responding to some general questions, in this case, the questions from Guatemala, so that you can use those as a reference. Through Kamira, we received these answers and we organized them and we gave them to Guatemala. And after this session, we are going to have all the presentations, and we're going to record this video conference, and we're going to have them on YouTube, and you will be able to find them on the webpage as well. And of course, we have the email contact for Michelle. And I understand also that a big part of this process, and this is what we did at Vocal, we have to generate a request through the webpage for Ifac, and then you have these forms where you're going to see a lot of questions. You're going to have to respond to those, and then you define the scope. So we're going to give you the link to that so that you know what it is. It's also part of the presentation. And so that is for Michelle, and so you have that too. And obviously for any other countries, if you have any other questions, any other concerns, you can share with us, and we're here at your service. Thank you, Juan. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Cynthia. We do not have any other questions on chat. I don't know if anybody else wants to make a comment. Does Guatemala have anything else they want to share or to say about the question that they had? Any other countries?
I have one question that was sent to me via direct message, so I translated it so I can answer it, so I'm happy to do that now. So the question was about the process for translating documents from English to Spanish, where a Spanish translation doesn't exist. So that's pretty simple as well. It's that same database, the OPRI database that you would go to. As Juan Torres said, we can provide all of the resources in terms of where exactly do you go, what is the policy. We have, I've recently updated documents that shows you exactly how to fill out a permission request for reproduction and translation. So that's another resource. It's all available on the one page for intellectual property on their website. But effectively, you would go in and you would request a translation of standards, if it's standards that you're looking to translate, or a translation of supporting publications. So there's a list of all of our published standards and guidance, and you can choose from there. And then again, you'll fill out the form. It'll have more detailed questions about who are the translators, what percentage of the document are you looking to translate, how will you be using it, the CVs of the translators, and just a question about the translations process. I will say, just as a note, that we do have regular translation of the standards by certain member bodies just because of the consistency and experience that they have. So unless there's a good reason why they wouldn't be translating it for those standards, we would, again, for consistency's purposes, we would continue with that translation. But if they're supporting publication, guidance, or standards that haven't been translated and there is a need for them, we would, of course, consider the translation request in that instance.
Bien, muchas gracias, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question that you sent to us. I do not see any raised hands. I don't know if any of the countries has anything else. Does anybody else want to ask something? Somebody else wants to open up their mic?
I can see a few raised hands. Raphael, I can see has his hand up.
Okay. Rafael.
Muy buenos días.
Very good morning. Good morning, Rafael Mendoza from El Salvador. Thank you. I heard the presentation. I think it's very interesting. All the countries that are in the process of implementing the standards, we have similar concerns. I think Salvador has very similar concerns to what Guatemala presented. It's very clear to me that regarding the request, the permission that we're asking, you will review it and you will see whether this implies any kind of cost or whether it doesn't, whether the reproduction will be integrated or not. But my question has to do with when I sign in, do I sign in as a person? Do I sign in as a country? And how long should I wait for my request to be responded?
Sure. So when you sign in, it'll be your individual email address, but when you make the permission request, it would be for the organization that you're requesting on behalf of. So if it's a PAO, professional accountancy organization, it would be that PAO. If it's for a regulator or governmental entity, you would put in that information so that we understand, the context in which it's being used and who's requesting it. Often it's not the individual just looking to request to reproduce something, because if you're looking to reproduce something as an individual or to refer to it, you don't need to go through the process. We want people to be able to refer to something individually. And then in terms of the turnaround time, we say typically to give us about 2 weeks before we kind of respond or issue the agreement. Oftentimes it doesn't take quite that long, but if the situation is particularly complex, or if we're in a busy period, we just ask that you give us at least that 2-week buffer, especially if there's a deadline that you're looking to work to. So I know a lot of times organizations will want to publish something at a specific date. So about 2 weeks, but I'll try and make it faster where I can.
Perfecto, perfecto, muy fino.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rafael. We also have a raised hand, Joaquin Montano from, if you can please open up your microphone.
Joaquin Montano from El Salvador. I don't see the hand raised anymore. Very well. Kamira Sánchez, Dr. Kamira Sánchez has a question, please. Thank you, Beatriz. Thanks, Michelle and Dave, for the excellent presentation. I did have a general question. Looking at the situation in Latin American countries, right now there are many budget restrictions, budget limitations. What could happen, or what might happen if a country sends a request and maybe the costs are too high for the situation in the country, if there's any issue with the budget that doesn't allow us to do it? What are the alternatives? Are there any subsidies from Ifac, or maybe donations from multilateral organizations to be able to afford the costs? I mean, Michelle, what would be the alternatives for those countries that want to implement the IASPs and don't have the resources to afford the costs?
So great question. I will say, to kind of set the scene, that our goal is always to help support adoption and implementation. So we would never look at price as a barrier. We would never, if a country just didn't have it in their budget, we wouldn't then say, well, too bad, you can't, adopt the IPSASB. That's never our goal. Our goal is to help support adoption and implementation. And part of that, when it comes to fees, is helping support the development of these standards as well. I will say, so in terms of the fees, we do base it on GNI, so gross national income. So we do actually take into account sort of the gross national income and any budgetary restrictions that might exist for a specific country. And in terms of our fees, I mean, I don't know if it's sort of being asked in sort of comparison to IFRS, for example, but our fees are and have historically been relatively low for the governments that have the highest sort of GNIs. The max that we kind of go to is 10 to 12,000 a year, but those are very few organizations pay that much. So it's really in a matter of, 1 to 5,000 per year is our general range, because we really want to make sure that it's not a barrier to access. But of course, if there is a situation where even that is too high of a fee, we would work with that country to still ensure that they would be able to adopt the standards that they need.
Gracias por la aclaración, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle, for the clarification. And to have a general idea, what would be the range, more or less, of those costs? We understand that it depends on the situation of in any country, but if we can have a range of what the approximate cost might be.
Yeah, so as I said, it really tops out at about 10 to 12,000 per year for the countries with a particularly high GNI. And as I mentioned, very few countries actually pay that much. So I would say a more realistic range that we see is about 1 to 5,000 per year as the annual license fee. This has sort of historically been the case. I know that we've had some discussions about reviewing these going forward, but as of today's date, that would be the sort of general range that you can expect.
Gracias.
Thank you. Joaquin Montano is saying that he's not able to open his microphone. He needs some permission to do that. If you can help him, if you can open Joaquin Montano's microphone, or maybe remove that restriction.
We'll look into that. Do we want to move on to the next question? We'll come back to Joaquin.
Sí, gracias, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, let's move on to Carol's question. She's raised her hand. If you can open her microphone now, please. Sorry, Harold, if you can open your microphone, please. Harold, please open your microphone so you can ask your question. We would like to know if we already had all the national standards based on the IASPS, and in the financial statements we disclosed that we're already working based on those norms, those standards, always using the indirect method. Would we also have to request permission? Would there be an additional cost for that or not anymore?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So again, it's difficult to say just in a very general scenario like this. That's why, again, with the permission request, we ask for as much detail as possible so that we can really assess the particular details of that request and let you know. But again, as just a general rule, if you are reproducing the words as written in the standard, that would necessitate an agreement. But again, just please feel free to submit a permission request so that I can review the particular details, and I'll be better placed to answer about the need for an agreement then.
Bien. Muchas gracias, Michelle.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. We have now the question from Joaquin Montano. If you can now open your microphone. I don't see him on anymore, Beatriz, Betty. I think that was the last question. Maybe we'll try to reach him to see what the question is. If not, we'll contact you after the session to share it. I think we are done with this session now. Thank you very much for all your participation, for the interest. There were a lot of people interested, obviously, because of this adoption process that we're trying to promote in every country. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and we will be sharing the content in the next few days. Thank you, Ifac, Michelle, the board, Dave, Ross, and Kamira, of course. Thank you very much for all your support, not only by supporting us here, but the platform that you have provided us, the support in all the technical sessions. IFAC has been supporting us with the translations. Greetings, Bianca, and thanks for being with us. And all the other countries present, thanks for participating and for your interest in the subjects that we've been discussing. So again, greetings from Mexico. Everybody have a very nice day. Thank you very much.